Hopefully you left your mark there in Daniel 1. So go back to Daniel 1. Reagan and I have a running joke. I give him a Dave's life lesson every week. This one is pay attention to the order of worship before you get up there and start talking. Today we're going to talk about Christians at work. And I wanted to follow along Mike's theme. He had asked that, well, he didn't ask. He asked me if I wanted to stay along the theme. I said, sure. And so that's where we are continuing along that theme. And yesterday, several of us went to Carolyn's funeral. And I just want to tell you that it was a wonderful service for those of you that didn't get to see it, a live stream. And Mike was very supported. So thank you all for giving him that support. On the way back, Brett and I, once he about killed me on the way there, on the way back, we were talking about today's sermon. And he said, well, if I were preaching this sermon, I'd ask a couple of questions. I want to start with the first question, in my own words, what Brett asked. If someone walked into your employer or your school and asked what people thought of you, what would your fellow employees or fellow students say? That's a tough question, perhaps, for some people. I can tell you in my own life, I would want to pick the people that you talk to at work, because sometimes I'm not always as kind to some of the people that I work with as I should be. There are some that would speak highly of me, but not everyone. That's a tough question for us. The second question, if I talk to your boss or teacher or the employees that work for you and ask them if you have ever talked about God with them, what would they say? Last week we talked about evangelism, 4 different lessons. And we spend more of our waking hours at work as adults than we do doing anything else, with the exception, perhaps, of spending time with family. And so if we don't ever talk with people about God at work, if we don't ever mention God, we are wasting all kinds of evangelistic opportunities. And so that's a question that we all need to think about. Again, I've talked with some of my fellow employees, but certainly not all of them at the university. And so we all can do better in this regard. Daniel is the lesson that we're going to start with this morning. This was not the original idea that I had, but a brother read the bulletin article, sent me some notes and said, hey, why don't you talk about Daniel? This will work well. And I thank that brother for sending that, because that's what we're going to talk about. Turn to Daniel 1, and we're just going to walk through Daniel's story as a way that a model for us as Christians to follow in our work environment. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasure of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's place, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. As we read on, we learn that Daniel was one of those people. Daniel had an involuntary transfer in his life. And he had a new job that he probably didn't want to have. But he flourished in that job, as we will learn later. And so, as I often find myself telling people at work, that's the reason they call it work sometimes. You're doing things you don't want to do in places you don't want to be doing them, in times you don't want to be doing them. That's the definition of work, in my estimation. And so when Daniel was transferred here, he likely didn't want to go, but that didn't stop him from being a godly example. In verse 5 we read, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of the time, they were to stand before the king. We don't know what that was. We don't know what that food entailed, but there's a really good chance it didn't follow the Jewish diet. And Daniel, for all these years, had been following that diet, and now he's told, you are going to eat a different food. In verse 5, we also learn that he had to attend a training that he didn't want to go to, more than likely. 3 years of training that Daniel went to. I don't even like doing a mandatory 1-hour training every year on anything, but I can't imagine 3 years of training for work that he didn't really want to do. Verse 6. Among those were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah, and the chief of the eunuchs he gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. Daniel had his employer change his name. I don't know that any of you took a job and then your boss said, "You're now going to be Joe." Doesn't really matter what your name was before, now you're going to be Joe. That's tough. I don't know about Daniel, but I would have been listening for Daniel for years. And when they called me by my new name, I would have been confused. But Daniel was forced to take a new name. And then in verse 8, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. Daniel said, "I'm not going to do this. This is not what God wants me to do. I'm not going to do this." And then in verse 9, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of eunuchs. And so when he asked the chief of eunuchs to allow him special favors, God allowed the chief of eunuchs to give him those special favors. Then let's read verse 10 through 16. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, "I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in the worse condition than youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king." This boss is just like a lot of our bosses today. You're going to make me look bad in front of my boss. You want these special favors, but you're going to make me look bad in front of my boss. Verse 11, then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see." If I've heard this once, I've heard this 100 times in my life. As a supervisor, don't come to me with a problem unless you have a solution. Daniel came to his supervisor with a problem. He said, "I don't want to do this." And the boss said, "Well, this is going to make me look bad if you don't do it." And then Daniel said, "Well, let's try this. Let's do this experiment." And he gave him a solution that allowed Daniel to follow God. Verse 14, so he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Here, Daniel's boss, the chief of eunuchs, said, "Okay, we'll try it." They tried it, and it worked. And so then the boss said, "Okay, we will do it your way." Some of you are bosses. Some of you have had employees come to you and say, "I don't really want to do this. Let's try it another way." And I can only speak for me, but a lot of the times I say, "Nope, this is what I came up with. This is the way we're going to do it." That's not always the best answer. And had the chief of eunuchs said that, this wouldn't have worked out for Daniel like it did. And then in verses 17 through 21, we learn about Daniel. And for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of the king of Cyrus. With God's help, Daniel and his friends flourished in the work environment. They were followers of God, and God blessed them, so they were 10 times better than their fellow employees. This is an example, a great example, of what we can do when we follow God in our work environment. We're not going to read much of Daniel 2, but many of you know the story. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He got all his folks to try to solve that dream. He couldn't do it. And then Daniel came and solved his dream for him. Again, with the help of God. He solved a problem that his boss had that others couldn't solve with his problem. And so God benefited his employer through Daniel. Daniel followed God. Now let's pick up in Daniel 2, verses 46 through 48. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar rewarded Daniel for being a good, godly employee. He promoted him. He gave him lots of benefits because Daniel was a good, godly employee. And then in verse 49, Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel remained at the king's court. Because of Daniel's godly friends, he knew that he got to where he was at. And so when he got the opportunity to return the favor to his godly friends, he did that. He blessed his friends who had helped him follow God. That's a great example. Daniel's a great example of an employee that used God to benefit both his employer and himself. Now, a lot of times we don't think about Daniel 1 through 3. What we think about happened a little bit later when things didn't go right for Daniel. But at least in the first 3 chapters, we understand that Daniel gives us a great example of how to be a godly employee. So now let's talk about some of the things that we've seen in Daniel's life. In Matthew 7, verse 12, in terms of employers, "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophet." I've worked a lot of terrible jobs in my life. And in some of those, I became a supervisor. If you've ever done restaurant management and didn't start as a server or a hostess, you don't really understand restaurant management. If you've ever been a police officer and didn't start on patrol, you don't understand patrol as a sergeant. Bosses need to remember how they wanted to be treated when they were employees. Some of you are Christian bosses. Christian employers need to remember that others were, or they were where others are now, and that they should treat them like they would want to be treated as employees. The best employers that I ever had been there where I was at, and they remembered being there where I was at. As a Christian employer, you've got all kinds of things coming at you, but you always have to remember, treat your employees like you would want them to treat you. Daniel's employers did that for a while. Both the chief of eunuchs and Nebuchadnezzar treated Daniel fairly. They could have said, "No, you can't change your diet. You're just going to do what we said." They could have not rewarded Daniel. He was their employee. So when he solved these dreams with God's help, they didn't have to do anything special for him. He was going to make the same pay, but they rewarded him. His employers rewarded good work. Thirdly, Daniel's boss trusted him. In those times when somebody came to me and said, "Dave, I would like to try it this way," if I trust them as an employer, I say, "Okay, let's try it your way." And you know what? A whole bunch of those times, their way was a lot better than my way, and increased the productivity of the organization that we were working for. As employers, as Christians, we need to trust our employees, particularly our Christian employees, our God-following employees. And then finally, in chapter 3, we remember the unreasonable demands that they made of Daniel. That was an ungodly request from the employer for Daniel to do something that was against God's will, and Daniel said, I'm not going to do it. So godly employers don't make unreasonable requests of their employees. They just don't do it. So as a Christian employer, don't make unreasonable requests of your employees. God doesn't want us to do that. So that's the employers. Now let's talk about faithful employees. Turn over with me to Matthew 25. Matthew 25. And in Matthew 25, beginning in verse 14, we read the parable of the talents. Now, we're not going to read all 16 of those verses. Most of you remember the parable of the talents well. The way it worked is a man left, a boss left. He said, I'm going to give each one of these a certain amount of talents, and I want them to use them while I'm gone. 5, 3, and 1. He gave those talents to his employees. When he got back, he said, all right, give me a report. The one that had 5 made 5 more. He was blessed. The one that had 3 made 3 more. He was blessed. The one that had 1 was scared. He said, I'm fearful of my boss. I don't want to take initiative. I don't want to do anything with this talent. And he was not blessed. As Christian employees, when we are given tasks and responsibilities, we need to do our best to fulfill those tasks and responsibilities. We need to do our very best and ask God for our help in working for our employer, because as Christians, we want our employers to be blessed by our presence and by our work, because we aren't working for them. We are working for God. God put us in that situation to work for them. And so when we as Christians are at work, we need to remember we are working for God. Your supervisor, whoever he is, from the CEO down to your immediate supervisor, they're all mid-level management. God is the owner of the business. God is the big boss. We are working for God, and when we work for God, we need to work for him like we do outside of work as well. And the other lesson that we can learn from Daniel is that faithful employees help their fellow employees, particularly the faithful ones. Those of you that have worked in environments where you've been promoted, and sometimes when you're promoted to supervise your peers, that is a really tough job, because you were there with them and now you're in charge, and sometimes they don't want to listen to you. But as a supervisor, you should look out for the people that are under you. And so when you as an employee go up in the system, you should try to take others with you. There are so many corporations where that's the way it started. The employees were on the bottom floor. 1 or 2 of them got promoted. They brought their fellow employees with them and eventually owned the company, and were very successful in the company. As employees, we need to remember those around us and reward those around us when we have the opportunity to do that. Now turn to Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6. We're not going to read that one again either, but all of you listened to Reagan, hopefully. And when you did, you remembered the story of the ants. Now, I must confess that as a child, I spent a lot of time with ants. And none of it was good times for the ants. I was always amazed at how I could put a rock in front of a bunch of ants, and they would just go around it and keep on with their mission. So I'd move the rock. I'd walk down a little bit. I'd put it in front of them again. And then they'd walk on with their mission. And sometimes I would hit them with the rock to see what the rest of them would do. And they would work on with their mission. Ants are the busiest critters that you will ever see in terms of working. They're all working. I guess they get in their anthill and do something other than work, but I've never been inside an anthill. I've been inside anthills, but they were all working once I took the top off the anthill. They are very industrious workers. We as Christians must be industrious workers. If I go to your employer and I say, who is your best employee? I want to hear that it's you. Because if you are the best employee, you are glorifying God in that employment. I don't want to hear, well, we got 7 employees and Dave's number 7. And if he wasn't a union shop, Dave would be gone. That's not what we as Christians need to do for our employers. We need to be workers just like the ants. And now turn to Colossians 3:22. Colossians 3:22. In Colossians 3, verse 22, all the way to chapter 4, verse 1, we get a common message for both employers and employees. Beginning in verse 22, bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. When you're surfing Facebook on the clock, you are serving the Lord Christ. Remember that. Your boss may not see you surf Facebook. God does. When you clock out 15 minutes before you were supposed to, and your boss don't catch you, God knows. And so when we are employees for an organization and we realize that we're working for God, we give our best effort because God is always watching us. When I was in several jobs, as soon as the boss left, I'll just use my uncle's. As soon as he left, I had a terrible job doing contracting work. I was the prep guy for painting outside houses in Alabama in July and August. And so whenever he left, sometimes I would go sit in the truck and turn on the air conditioning. He never knew that. He's already gone. God knew that. God was sitting there watching while Dave was enjoying the air conditioning instead of scraping the walls. If we remember that God is our boss, it will structure our work in ways that we're probably not doing when we don't remember that. And then in verse 24, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward, you are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. This week I was talking to James with another group of people. James is my oldest. And she asked him how he liked his job. And he said he liked most aspects of the job, but he was talking about 1 or 2 aspects of his job he didn't really like. And she said, you know, you've got a really good job. If there's only 1 or 2 aspects you don't like, you've got a really good job. And you know what? If one of those 2 aspects you don't like is a lying, cursing coworker, and that's not what the example he used, but if he had a lying, cursing coworker, you're not going to change that. God will recompense that reward at some point. And so as Christian employees, sometimes we have to work in environments with people we don't want to work with that are sinful people. God will fix that. And then chapter 4, verse 1, for employers, masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. If you own the corporation, you're still mid-level management. You're working for God. And God is your master, and as a boss, you always need to remember that God is your boss, and that the things you do to your employees, you will answer to God for, because God is our boss. In Matthew 5:16, the scripture that Ken read earlier today, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. The main point of today's lesson is, as Christians, whatever we're doing, wherever we're at in that organization, we need to let our light shine so that others see our good works and know that God is the reason why we're doing what we're doing. That's a tremendous responsibility. It's a tremendous command, but it's something that we need to think about every time we have a situation at work where we're thinking ungodly thoughts or thinking about taking ungodly actions. God is our boss. We need to let that light shine for others. This morning, if you haven't been baptized for remission of sins, you may call yourself a Christian, but you're not a Christian by the New Testament standard. When we have these assemblies, we always want to offer the invitation for those that haven't been baptized for remission of sins to do so. If you believe that Christ is the Son of God, or willing to confess that he is, repent of your sins, we would love to baptize you this morning. Many of you are baptized believers, and today's the first day in a long time perhaps that you've thought about your work environment and how you're not living Christ in your work environment. If you need prayers from the shepherds, they will be happy to pray for you. Or if you need prayers in any other regard, just let us know as we stand and sing this song.